weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. What typifies weird cultures is the number one thing is they're incredibly individualistic. Asian cultures, African cultures, Latin American cultures, and certainly Chinese cultures is much more collectivist. But we're operating in a weird world, where some of those same behaviors that we consider respectful, people will look at us and say, oh, this person has no ideas. And where there is a cultural gap, there will be a gap in equity.
Welcome to the Tao of Chao podcast, where we will try to find balance and provide a clearer path forward in this uncertain world. Joy Chen is a luminary in leadership development. Her career, spanning public service, executive search, and leadership training across 3 continents, reflects her dedication to fostering leadership potential. She was the deputy mayor of Los Angeles and spearheaded programs for opportunity access that continue to shape public policies today. After 7 years of executive search experience at Henrich and Struggles, Joy started leadership training, which began with a career block that went viral in China. Today, she is the CEO of the Multicultural Leadership Institute. Her innovative approach to leadership development, especially in cross-cultural dynamics, has been extensively covered by media including the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Economist, and Vogue China. And here is Joy. Joy, thank you so much for being my guest at Tao of Chao.
Oh, glad to be here, Philip.
So Joy, we have spoken many times and I think I got to know you a little bit better. But for our audience, please tell us a little bit about your background and really your personal journey, which is fascinating. Would love to hear about how your journey is to where you are now as the founder and CEO at the Multicultural Leadership Institute. Please.
Sure. Well, I was born in the United States in Maryland, and my parents had both immigrated from China. My father had come from China very early on in the 1960s. My mother as well. He came to the United States and he studied at MIT. My mother studied at Cornell. Mm-hmm. So they were part of this very early generation of Chinese who came after Kennedy allowed the top students from Asia to come to the United States to study. Mm. Both of them were in technical careers. My father got an engineering degree. My mother worked as a biochemist. Yeah. And both of them worked as individual contributors their entire careers, both for the federal government. When I was small, growing up in Maryland, outside of DC, my parents had worked very hard to buy a small house in a good school district, which meant that we were the only Chinese in a school that was nearly all white. We're almost the only other Chinese. There's one other Chinese family. Mm. For me, I feel like my journey all started one night when I was about 13 years old. My father came home from work and he said, tonight's the night of my department's Christmas party. Actually, it was in the evening. I said, oh, why didn't you go? Yeah. And he said, because every time I go to those things, I never know what to say to people. Mm. Yeah. And I felt like a lightning bolt had crashed down on my head. And I suddenly realized that my dad and I had 2 things in common. One, he didn't know how to talk to white people. And 2, I realized that this problem would forever limit his career as well as his life here in the United States. It didn't matter that he'd come from China, had studied at MIT, and now was the hardest worker in his entire department. His entire career, he remained an individual contributor. My mom's similar story. So that night, I decided that I wanted to figure out how white people tick, how mainstream society actually works, so that I could get out there and do something. And that really was the start, I would say, of my entire professional journey. After that, I worked really hard to figure out how to connect. And I had some amazing mentors. At age 31, I was appointed deputy mayor of Los Angeles, which is a city where 90 plus languages are spoken. So it's really my job leading economic and workforce development to help all those people integrate. Then I was recruited to Henrich and Struggles, which is a global executive search firm. And then for 7 years, I found CEOs and board members for Fortune 500 companies. I started a careers blog on the unwritten rules of the game, and that blog went viral in China.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah. There were some students, Chinese students at USC and UCLA, some Liu Shisheng, who translated the blog into Chinese and put it all over Renrenwang at the time. I don't know if you know Renrenwang. There's like old time, before Weibo, before WeChat, before Xiaohongshu. So anyway, there was Renrenwang. And so they put it on Renrenwang, and that went viral all around the world among Liu Shisheng circles. And then I was asked to write a book for Chinese women in China. I was asked to write a book by CITIC Press, by Zhongxin Chubanshi. I wrote a book called Do Not Marry Before Age 30, 30前别结婚. That became a big bestseller in 2011. Yeah. I wrote a second book called How to Get Lucky in Your Career, right there, called 30岁趁势而为. And then I launched a sort of global leadership training business in China. I had 9 people in Beijing. We had all kinds of courses and speeches. I partnered with the 十点读书 and all these other platforms. And then when the pandemic happened, well, first the trade war and then pandemic, I had to shut down all of that. And now I'm here in the US doing similar work. I'm doing global leadership development. My firm is called the Multicultural Leadership Institute. Primarily, I help leadership teams and sales teams, so mostly white people who are leading them, for the most part, since this is now the United States, helping them to develop the cultural fluency, to unify their teams, and to expand their markets globally. And then also within that, I do specific leadership training for Asian Americans.
How exciting. I mean, that we can just spend the next 40 minutes talking about just that journey and how you got there, because I think even a white person, let's go through this, may not be as accomplished as what you have already so far. I mean, from politics to corporate America to talking about leadership, talking about all these things and helping Chinese in China from a cross-cultural standpoint to get better understanding. I think the current, well, I don't want to get political, but the current struggle between U.S. and China would hopefully be better if we are able to have more communication, if we are able to have more cross-country dialogue.
Yeah.
I remember in the old days, I'll get off that topic. In the old days, if you talk to some of the presidents and leaders of emerging markets, they all talk about Elvis Presley. They all talk about all this soft power, right, of America. They all came here, they studied, and they can speak English. They understand the American way, and they have this understanding. They share something. They share something back to their youth, right? And so they can identify, and they feel that they can communicate. You know, a lot of people find it very strange when Xi Jinping comes to the United States. Always go back to those people that he first met some 20, 30 years ago, right? Iowa. Amazing. I mean, you think about it. So, what is the linkage? What are they thinking? But there's actually a lot of linkage, because when he was a young man, he was sent down to the villages for hard time purposes because his family was out of favor. So he was doing a lot of farming things. So he appreciate farming. He appreciate farming areas. He appreciate Iowa, and also he remembered these are people who welcomed him to his home and spent time. And he was not a muckety-muck, so to speak, at the time. There's relationship to be built. And I applaud what you have done. From what I'm just hearing, I don't even know all the things you have done, but that you are building bridges, making connections, so that we begin to have an understanding of each other. I just don't think we are doing any of it anymore. I know Xi Jinping was talking about 50,000 students over the next 5 years to welcome 50,000 American students to China. Wow. I wish that U.S. will also set up a number to say we welcome 150,000 students to this country. You know, I'm just making it up as I go.
Yeah.
But this whole notion of really starting with our younger generation.
Yeah.
To begin to understand each other, because I think America will be strong for a long time, and China will continue to climb those ladders, and we have to deal with each other. Why don't we deal with each other in a pleasant, in a friendly, with an understanding and communicative ways to minimize any misunderstanding?
I totally agree with what you're saying. We are living in such a polarized world.
Yes.
And I think that that story about Xi Jinping always talking about the family in Iowa and going back to visit them when he comes to the United States is really amazing, because what Iowa, recently had our election, and it's incredibly white, incredibly rural.
Yes.
And even at a place that is so homogeneous, we find that personal relationships are what can really open up our mind and our perspectives.
Yes.
I think that so much of my work, and I know your work, has been to help people be more effective at establishing those personal relationships and engaging and mobilizing the people that we work with and want to work with.
Let's spend a little time on your institute, if I may.
Sure.
So on your institute website, it states that this is where advanced leadership training, which is what you do, meets cultural innovation, in quote. And so what I think you're doing is you're marrying the robust leadership skills with deep cultural insights to really excel, to speed forward in a digitally interconnected, which is where we are now, right? And culturally diverse business world, which is a wonderful thing. So this sounds like you are basically injecting now the overused word diversity. We think that we all understand what diversity means. I challenge that. When people use that word, what do they really understand diversity?
Yeah.
And the benefits of cross-cultural investments. Why is that significant, right? In human capital, right? For leadership success. It's not even for leadership success alone. I know that's what you do, but really for human success.
Yes.
For relationship success. And leadership is born out of that.
Yeah.
Help us understand a little bit about how decision makers, whom you primarily work with first, embrace this mental shift. How do you change somebody or groups of people who may not have the pleasure of your education, your guidance, your enlightenment, if you would, to understand why your version of diversity, your version of cross-cultural understanding, may I even dare say appreciation, it's really necessary.
I think that when we talk about the word diversity in the United States context, a lot of it has been within the framework of what we've called DEI in the last few years, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Which has been a very important shift in companies to help them to expand opportunities for all people. But I think that when we talk about DEI within the United States, it's been a lot focused on race primarily, and to a lesser extent, gender.
Yes.
And I think that one thing that happens then is sometimes we end up sorting the world into like two buckets of people: diverse people, like women and people of color, and then non-diverse people, white men, straight white men.
Yes.
And I think that when we look at things from the broader span of humanity, which is what I do, like we look at things from the standpoint of sort of anthropology and how societies have evolved over time, we find that, in fact, we all are sort of a mosaic of identities. We all are diverse in our own ways. I was just playing pickleball this week with a guy. He says, I come across as a straight white guy, but actually I'm Palestinian.
Oh.
And Palestinians are classified as white in the United States. My family this and all this background. He's very global. But people look at him, they're like, you're in this bucket, right? So I think that so that's one thing, is this idea of what is diversity and what is culture.
Yeah.
And I think that culture sometimes it's hard to talk about because, especially in the United States, it's such an individualistic society. We think, I'm not shaped by my culture. I make all of my choices. But the fact is, there are things that are universal to all of us as human beings. And there's very interesting research that shows like all human beings, anthropologists think there are about 300 things that we all do in common. Like we all gossip. We all enjoy eating our food socially with other people. We all have ceremonies around our food. We all have sex in private. We all, all of these things that are different from other species, right? So there are all these universal things. We all want the best for our children, right? So these are all things that hold us together as humans. But we all want to be respected, okay? We all want to respect other people.
Yes.
Then there's a whole body of cultural things. What we consider respectful behavior differs from culture to culture.
Yes.
How we perceive leadership differs from culture to culture. The same leadership behaviors that we think will be successful here will be not successful there. And so those are these cultural aspects. And so we want to help our clients, our learners, to develop a very sophisticated understanding of how different groups of people look at the world so that we can successfully engage and motivate all kinds of people, not just the people who come from the same background as our own, right? And then the third layer, I would say, there's universal, cultural, individual. That's where, while we're invisibly shaped by the groups, principally the group that we grew up in, our families, we also make our own independent choices. So we're invisibly shaped by them, but we also, in turn, invisibly shape all of the groups around us through our independent actions. And so I think it's really giving our learners, our partners, sort of an understanding of all of these aspects so that we can be more powerful, more effective in how we relate in the world, and also so that we can have more powerful and effective and enjoyable and meaningful personal relationships, as you point out.
For sure. I think so much of what you talk about is, in that order, has to do with human behavior of tribalism.
Yes.
Is survival. We go back to our primal brain, thinking fight and flight. I know it's not everything divided into that, but there's this whole notion that I'm more comfortable when I see somebody who look more like me, or somebody that I grew up with, or somebody that we speak the same language or same tongue, in the same accent even.
Exactly.
And I feel a comfort because or the same religion, whatever that may be, that I have a baseline trust and understanding. At least that's how we think we do, right? The fact that we do or not is probably can be questioned.
Yes.
And then when we venture outside of that, is another tribe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, they may not be as predictable. They may eat their food differently. They may look at things differently. And it seems like the type of education and the kind of instruction, the kind of insight that you can share with those who need your guidance are people who you perhaps need to show them how cross-cultural is actually an advantage, that we see things from a different framework. We solve problems with different methodology that we have not thought of because we default back to the way we think and the way we were brought up.
Right.
And that diversity is missing, isn't it?
Yes. I think that, most of us, we all look at the world through these cultural goggles, right? Starting with, these goggles are really imparted to us from our families, starting with what language do you speak, right? Yes. I mean, we all have brains that could be accepting any language, right? But we were brought up, most of us, have one native language, and that's our dominant language, especially for Americans, that stays with us through our lives. And then even when we get locked in, from a neurology standpoint, it's very fascinating how when we get locked in English, it also uses certain parts of the brain and causes us, therefore, to approach problem solving in certain more analytical ways than in some other. So there's some refining that happens. It allows us to become very expert in certain ways, but it can become very easy to start to feel like my cultural goggles are the way everybody looks at the world and to make all those assumptions. And so to me, the skill of cultural fluency, which is the main thing that we imbue our learners with, is to understand what is universal, to understand what is cultural, and to see these, to recognize and to be able to very fluidly shift out our cultural goggles to shift and adapt as needed so that we can also adapt our behaviors and more effectively engage. Now, I think that this is it's something that I think we're all on a journey on. I think for me, growing up in a very white society, I sort of developed the ability to adapt as a survival instinct,
Yeah.
And so I became like a chameleon.
Yes.
And I could fit into any crowd. And that's really an important part of my being successful when I was deputy mayor and then a CEO headhunter. Like whoever I could be the ultimate people pleaser.
Yes.
Whoever you want me to be, I will be that person. But I think that for me, when I hit around 40, I looked very successful on the outside. But inside, I was really kind of lost. And because I was always kind of denying my own self, I didn't really know what I stood for. And my Chineseness was always something that was a sort of shame for me growing up.
Yes.
And so it was such a gift to be invited to China and to spend 9 years working full time in China. And I got really deeply rooted in my own Chinese language and culture. And I think that experience of being completely immersed in a different culture and being able to look back at American society with a different set of eyes, that experience is what made me develop the cultural fluency that I have today, becoming really bicultural. And now I'm back in the US, and now I can look at the world in a whole set of eyes. So I think being deeply immersed in one or more than one culture, that gives you such an advantage in doing this. And so what I'm working on is sort of helping people, accelerate people through that. So you don't have to get up and move to a different culture, but you can very quickly and fluidly be able to shift your goggles and to be able to adapt your behaviors as needed, right? So it's not like I have to do it in order to be accepted. I understand what my goals are. I understand deeply what the other person's goals are, and I can do it strategically so that we can effectively co-create mutual success.
So what you have gone through is you overcompensated. You've done so well in adapting that you have lost yourself to some extent.
Yes.
And then you went to China and you came back. You found that balance, which is what Chinese is all about, is finding that balance. But through that experience, I think it's about confidence of who you are and be okay of who you are. And it's a lifetime journey.
Yes.
Because I remember one of the first part of your story was, I'm not even sure I want to be Chinese. I just want to be like everybody else in this country. So I don't have to deal with all this.
Right.
And it's surprisingly how many immigrant children or immigrants, not necessarily immigrants, but their children, share that same feeling at one time in their lives because they rather not have to deal with that struggle. They rather just say, okay, I give up. I just want to be you. And then we move on.
Well, it's just like, not being invited to any dance in high school,
right.
It's like
exactly.
You're kind of told.
Exactly. Interesting. One more question on the Institute, if you don't mind.
Sure.
On your website, you also list the Asian Leadership Development. And it sounds to me pretty exciting and very much needed. Tell us a little bit about that aspect of your entire offering.
So right now, it's mostly for companies that want to unlock the potential of their Asian. There are companies, especially in the knowledge industries, that 30 or 40% of their professional workforce is Asian.
Yes.
And yet many of them are limited to entry-level professional jobs, or kind of can move up, maybe to the manager or director level, but have there's so many barriers to their moving further on up and contributing to their full potential to corporate goals and aspirations. And so we've done a lot of incredible research into what specifically are the behavioral cultural gaps between Asian leadership cultures and Western leadership cultures. How do we help our learners to become very cognizant, rooted firmly in their own identity, and be able to adapt in a very fluid way so that they can meet all the leadership requirements and norms and expectations of Western companies. So that is sort of like for companies. I am considering rolling out some, just on a B2C basis, some specific training for Chinese and Asians, focused on Chinese, who want to develop these skills and understand the unwritten rules of the game. It's sort of like having the ultimate corporate insider show you what are the unwritten rules of the game.
Yeah.
How do we develop the skills the soft skills that Western companies demand? So I'm thinking about doing that, but if anyone's interested in learning about that, or if they just want my free 15-page guide on what are the unwritten rules, they can just go to my website and download that. It's at themli.net/rules.
We will have it on the show notes. Thank you for that. So before I forget, again, I think what I have learned, I want to, again, thank you for your passion, for your work, for your leadership, and serving as really a role model. In other words, we can look at you and we say, gosh, I too can. And this possibility for all women and Asians, and especially Chinese in this case, we too can be a full participant in the goodness in the workplace.
Of course.
And I think that a lot of times I feel that when I look back at some folks that I come to know and other observations, that it's not so much anybody else discriminating against us, is that we want to stop discriminating against ourselves. In other words, unconstrain ourselves, let's fully integrate into the society without losing oneself. It's a set of skills, and it's a maturation process. It doesn't just come like turn on a light bulb. Okay, tomorrow I'm all set. I think one thing that you and I, if I may suggest, that at least we can speak like we are Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we turn off the screens, people probably wouldn't know that we are not American in the white tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have fully, to the extent the word integrated, if that makes sense, into the society. And I also hope that from what I'm hearing from you today, at least, and of course in the past, that you haven't lost your cultural identity, you haven't lost your heritage, you haven't lost your language, you haven't lost anything. Mm-hmm. In fact, because of the combination of the two, it enriched you and those who you touch.
Yeah.
That's really where we want to go. So each one of us should be able to have that. I celebrate that with you. Mm. So, as you know, I'm a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong, and I came to the United States to go to University of Southern California, a school across the city from you, where you went, UCLA. And over the years, I have observed and learned about the majority of immigrant Chinese and many first-generation Chinese have not moved up, like you said, in the Western corporate ladder. And as a group, the Chinese immigrant population has really done, I think, done very well as entrepreneurs, like store owners. My in-laws, they own all the small businesses you can imagine, from fixing shoes to groceries to hotels to all of those little things that little cities along California. You know the story, from San Francisco all the way down to LA.
Great.
Some of them are because of themselves, like your father and your mother, who came and went to school and become professionals of their own right, or physicians and optometrists or dentists and accountants and scientists and engineers, etc. And you know well that the stereotypical Chinese or the stereotype of Chinese is that we are a silent minority, or the model minority. Make no waves, hardworking, head down, pay our taxes, and keep to ourselves. So I have my suspicion as to the contributing factors, not only the first generation, but even sometimes second generation, still holds a lot of that kind of either perception or otherwise, the factors that perpetuates this stasis. It just goes on. And so I know that your lecture and you train on this subject. So tell us some of the reasons why we are where we are, and what is holding us. If we want to think of holding us back, I don't mean somebody holding us back. I mean, it seems like we may be doing some of that holding back. And what would it take, for individuals, Chinese, to break out like you have, right? I know you already shared your personal story, but maybe there are lots of other reasons that we haven't touched on, and that would be really helpful to sort of explore just a little bit.
A lot of it, honestly, is this gap in cultures. That Western cultures are dominated by a different way of being in the world. Yeah. Anthropologists, there's a very famous anthropologist, Joe Henrich, he's actually the chair of cultural anthropology at Harvard. He describes Western cultures with a fun acronym. It's called WEIRD. Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies.
Amazing.
And it's a great acronym because what he's found is that weird cultures, people from weird societies, are only 12% of the world's population.
Wow.
And if you think about it, they dominate global companies, Western companies. It's like, so weird is a good substitution for the word Western. But what's great about the weird acronym is that it's a reminder of what he says: weird cultures, weird personalities are some of the most unusual personalities in the world.
Mm.
In fact, much of psychological literature, so if you look at, he and his team did a study of the major psychology journals, and they found that over 90% of the subjects that are studied in psychology journals, major psychology journals, are weird subjects.
Oh.
It was like 92% of all the subjects that are studied in those studies. And most of them are undergraduate students.
Right.
So that's another even more specific subset. And yet we're making extrapolations about human nature based on these weird people. And what typifies weird cultures is the number one thing is they're incredibly individualistic. And also they tend to break down problem solvings in a very analytical way. Asian cultures, African cultures, Latin American cultures, and certainly Chinese cultures is a much more collectivist. So oftentimes we look at the world from the standpoint of we really want to contribute to a team. We really want to make sure that we don't make the person that we're talking to look bad.
Yes.
We're so respectful that way. But we're operating in a weird world, where some of those same behaviors that we consider respectful, people will look at us and say, oh, this person has no ideas. Oh, this person has no leadership skills. And so I think it's, number one, the most important thing is to understand the unwritten rules of the game in Western companies. That's why I wrote, this book is sort of a free asset. It's just a 15-page book, but it's a small book to help people understand these cultural differences, so that, I think that oftentimes as I talk to other Chinese, oftentimes people say, oh, my company is so racist. Look, there's no Chinese at the top, and then we're 40% at the bottom. And I think to label something as racism is, yes, this isn't a general category of racism. I think of racial bias as more of like, you look at somebody and you categorize them according to their skin color, and then you assign all these attributes to them. And there is that racism, but there's also a broader thing where even as people get to know us and they observe our behaviors beyond that skin deep look, there's still this gap.
Yes.
And where there is a cultural gap, there will be a gap in equity, right? So I think it's incredibly important because our companies are not fully inclusive of all cultures as they aspire to be. For people who are not members of the cultural majority, including especially Chinese, who tend to be the biggest part of the non-cultural majority in many places, and the most different, because in many cases our behaviors, our cultures are the most different from the dominant culture. It's even more important for us to understand the unwritten rules of the game. So that would be the most important thing that I would say, that people start to really closely observe, like, if you're in a meeting, actually, we can just sort of think of ourselves as a cultural anthropologist. If you're in a meeting, rather than just pay attention to the content of the meeting, really start to watch the dynamics and be like, who's the most influential person here? Why is that person so influential? What specifically is the source of their influence? How do they behave? How many times are they speaking in this meeting? What do they say? How do other people react to them? How do they react to the other people? And then we can also say, who has no influence in this meeting? And what is that person doing wrong? On a meta level, in addition to participating in the meeting, try to see what's really going on invisibly.
So it reminds me of when my daughter went to high school, there was a whole discussion about extroverted people and introverted people, and how this culture tend to reward is too strong a word, but certainly provide a notice to the extroverts
Yes.
and not much to the introvert.
Yeah.
Although they may be intellectually equal,
Yeah.
everything else equal, it's just the expression of oneself is different.
Yeah.
How this society operate is almost exactly opposite of how Chinese culture is.
Yes.
Almost exactly opposite.
Exactly. So if we go beyond that,
Yeah.
so if we look at it from the standpoint of organizational psychology, the weird prototype of leaders are charismatic, assertive, dominant, which are almost precisely the opposite of stereotypes of Chinese.
Yes.
Of being non-assertive, non-dominant, non-charismatic. And there's also what organizational psychologists call a stable prototype of what is the ideal follower in weird cultures. The ideal follower is highly competent, hardworking, dedicated. And those are precisely the stereotypes of Chinese.
Yes.
So from a stereotype bias standpoint, and stereotype bias is, from the standpoint of unconscious biases,
Yes.
Chinese suffer a double whammy. We are 180 degrees opposite perceptions of us of the weird dominant leader stereotype. And we're 100% aligned
The follower.
to the follower prototype. Right. So that's why we have to disprove those. And that's why we have to build the personal connections to overcome those stereotypes.
So if you look at what you just said, and I look at Asian cultures, we notice in this country, Indian Americans have appeared to have gotten through the corporate ladder better than Chinese Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And just listening to what you just said, they are more assertive, or appear to be. They're able to express themselves and willing to express.
Yes.
I'm not saying they don't deserve what they get. That's not where I'm going. I'm just saying we are all Asian. If you want to look at Asian, Central Asian or East, however you want to categorize.
Mm-hmm.
And they are immigrants as much as we are immigrants. And those are traits that differentiated them. And precisely, they are much more like the weird people than their own people.
Mm-hmm.
However, that is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Confucius, what it preaches and what it stands for is precisely those traits that you're talking about, and also give a lot of respect, lots of humility. Humility is exactly opposite to saying, yeah, I know everything.
Exactly.
Let's ask you this question. In school, where many Chinese from mainland or from Taiwan or wherever come to this country, and their first exposure is as a student. And they go to school, and either they finish school and try to find a job here, which then we go into this whole thing, maybe stay forever as a follower, or they go home and they don't really integrate into the society. But during school, what are some of the things that you would recommend? Because they all fit the stereotype of not raising their hand, not talking in class, not asking questions, just heads down and say, okay, whatever the teacher says, I'll write it down. That very traditional way of learning.
Yeah.
And American schools are not traditional Asian way of learning at all.
Yeah.
And so teachers and professors may get frustrated and not knowing if you're even participating and have no idea what you're thinking. Any thoughts on that? And as sort of, I put you on the spot. I mean, that may not be one of the things that you think about, but how do we help kids who are here in their 20s to start thinking about weird versus not weird, and how can they have even more successful academic career beyond grades?
I think that the most important thing in school, because I have been a CEO headhunter for a long time, I was a CEO headhunter for 7 years. I saw who really made it to the top in American society, and they weren't necessarily the best students at all. And I found that having all of these skills, these cultural skills, these social skills, being able to deeply connect and motivate people is actually more important than grades. I would encourage young people, whether they're students or they're already in the workforce, to, again, work hard on making those connections. And I think that, sometimes in groups, it's a lot harder than one-on-one.
Yeah.
But I think that there are a lot of natural allies out there. It's easy to hang out with the people that we feel most cozy and comfortable with. but there are people out there that we can be friends with and who are open to and interested and excited to learning about other cultures, and who we can also make friends with.
Yeah. What about, you think, is there any issue with most mainland Chinese? I'm not picking on them, but I happen to know them. Their understanding English may be excellent.
Yeah.
But their speaking is not quite as good as their understanding.
Yes.
They come across more foreign than they may be even.
Yeah.
And what are some of the things? I know I'm touching on a kind of a sensitive issue. Not just Chinese. I mean, I'm sure everybody who have a native tongue is something else that they certainly have an accent. But do you find that is sort of almost like a handshake and how you shake somebody's hand, and how much you grip and how strong you all that stuff?
Yeah.
Speaking with an accent vis-a-vis a more improved English, would that help in cutting down the barrier a little bit, or you don't think that's an issue at all? I'm just curious.
I think that there's a lot of accent bias in American society, and that's just a reality. That's one thing. But we all have different pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
My great mentor in life, Charlie Wu, had polio as a child, and he became chairman of the board of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. For 4 generations, for 30 years, he's been a close advisor to mayors of Los Angeles. And he's an immigrant from Hong Kong who speaks with an incredibly thick accent, and he's in a wheelchair. So if Charlie can do it with the incredibly thick accent that he has, so we all have barriers.
Yeah.
Some have more barriers than others, but there are fixed barriers, and we work to overcome them. I do think that there is a significant amount of accent bias in society, and we overcome that by developing relationships and showing people how helpful and valuable and amazing we are.
When my daughter went to college at Northeastern several years ago, and I said, are there any Chinese students there? Said, oh yeah, there are lots of Chinese from China.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, why don't you befriend them?
Yeah.
Spend time with them, get to know them. Oh no, they just want to hang out with themselves. You know how they are.
Yeah.
They are. Any minority group initially. I said, well, they hang out with them because they feel most comfortable, not because they don't like you.
Yeah.
They are not confident to venture out on them by themselves. And that if you can understand that, I think you will get to know them, and they will include you. They will be your friend.
Yes.
But you need to take the first step.
Yes.
Because asking them to take first step is probably very difficult. I sound almost like a parent. That's not what I'm trying to do. But there are some basic things that I think we can certainly do to help young students, or I call them young students. They're not young anymore. I mean, they're in their 20s. They're not young. But these are important years when they spend in America, and what their experience is and how they develop those experiences will be impactful for the rest of their lives. Yeah. And also impactful for the people around them. We go back to how we first started this conversation. And again, I think what you're doing is fantastic. And the more you can do this, the more people get influenced, and the better the work can be. So I really enjoyed listening to your journey and listening to what you're doing and how you get to where you are. And the more people you touch, hopefully the more people can turn the corner.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. I don't really do much right now for Chinese in the United States. I mean, as I said, I had all these books for 9 years. I was in China, and helping young Chinese become more global was my 100% focus.
Sure.
Right now, unfortunately, if it weren't for the trade war and the pandemic, I would still be there. But I very sadly had to hang all of that up and come to the United States, where I have a new focus. And so sadly, I'm not doing that much for the Chinese right now, but I did write this free guide. And so to the extent that it could be helpful to people that will make me happy.
I know you can be helpful, but
Yeah.
we try to pull you a little bit towards that, and
I want to think about how I can be helpful in the time that I have.
and I will also say that the term DEI can be poisonous, can be divisive, as I understand it, as I hear it. Not me, I don't find it divisive, but because the people who take that and implement it is basically, like you said, on racial lines. And really, it's not just race alone. That's just one component. It's so easy, right? Use race as the dividing line is the easiest because you can just see it and you say, that's it. Whereas culture is a lot deeper, a little bit more complex, not so easily divisible and understandable.
Yes.
So I think that that's one message I'm getting out from you, is that I think people take the easy way out. Oh, okay, diversity, black, white, people of color, people not of color. That's it. That's all we need to do.
Yeah.
But that's a very shallow understanding of the word diversity. And in fact, it's an offensive way of learning about diversity. And that it is really should be, instead of D, should be C, should be cultural, rather than diversity in terms of race. It should be a cultural diversity because Black people have different culture too. It's not they are all monochrome. People of color have all these different, it's a spectrum of color. Yeah. So thank you, Joy. I've taken a lot of your time, and I know this is important to me, and I know it's important to you. So thank you for being my guest and sharing your thoughts, which is what I was hoping for.
Everyone, I'll be writing more to the extent that I write about this stuff on my LinkedIn. So people are welcome to follow me if they want to, listen more to these ideas. And please feel free to write in the comments and, join our network and just, comment about these things. And actually contributing in the conversation on LinkedIn is a really great way to find like-minded people.
Great. I am your student already, so.
Oh, I've loved being with you, Philip.
Thank you.
And to you, best of wishes to you and to all of your listeners and fans of the Tao of Chao podcast.
Thank you so much. We'll talk again. Thank you.
I look forward to staying in touch.
You can always find more episodes by visiting philipchao.us/podcast or find us on your favorite podcast app. You can always leave us feedback, ask questions, or request a topic for us to discuss by sending an email to pc@philipchao.us.
Views expressed in the Tao of Chao podcast are individual opinions, and they do not represent the employers of each guest or the firm each guest is associated. Our podcasts are for educational and informational purposes only and should not be deemed or viewed as investment advice or recommendations. Please consult your personal financial advisor, investment expert, or investment fiduciary before taking any actions about your plan and investments.